Perfect. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So as Rana said, I'm going to speak about how orthography and backward transfer may influence the way bilinguals are speaking. And so I'm going to present two separate studies that speak to that question. So I suggest if you have any questions, you can ask them in between, actually. So when I finish with the first study, that might be a good point to ask clarification questions. But of course, if anything is unclear along the way, feel free to interrupt me and let me know. All right. Okay, so basically, everyone who is studying bilingualism from a linguistic perspective is more or less concerned with cross-linguistic influence. So as you can see here, I did a Google Scholar search on cross-linguistic influence in bilinguals, and I got close to 300,000 hits. So this is really a well-researched area, and it's dating back many, many decades. And what this research mainly showed is that the L1 and the L2 constantly interact. So I guess it's fair to say that approximately 95% of the research has been conducted on the effect an L1 may have on an L2. So this is, you know, the kind of obvious case. So probably by now you can tell that I'm not a native speaker of English, and perhaps you can even tell that I'm a native speaker of German. And this is precisely because my L1 might be influencing my L2. But the opposite is actually quite common as well. So the L2 may influence the L1 as well, and this can take different forms. So on the one hand, it can be a more permanent case, so to say. That would be L1 attrition. So consider someone who's moving from one country to the other and is now suddenly very much exposed to the L2 and doesn't speak the L1 very much anymore. In this case, it would be expected that over an extended period of time, the L2 is really influencing the L1, and certain L1 properties might deteriorate, kind of, you know, possibly leading to what is perceived as a foreign accent in the L1. But L2 to L1 influence might also be very temporary. So consider, for example, having a conversation in your second language and then switching back to your first language. In this case, it would be quite likely that for a short period of time, you continue to have L2 properties in your L1. But, you know, this, as I said, is very temporary. So this effect would probably fade away very, very quickly. Okay, so this is really the core of the research on cross-linguistic influence in bilinguals that has been done. But today I would like to draw your attention to, well, obviously two other factors that may play a role. And the first one is the possible effect a third language may have in this interaction. And this is actually very important because, as it turns out, in 2021, more than 61% of all upper secondary education students were learning 2 or more non-native languages in a majority of EU member states. And I mean, this situation is obviously not limited to the EU. I think it is fair to assume that multilingualism is actually the norm in most of the world's countries. Okay, so basically, chances are that when you read a paper on bilingualism and that presents the participants as being bilingual, chances are that they are actually trilingual. And the researchers are simply not interested in the third language the participants may speak. Could also be that the proficiency in the third language is considered very low, so people think it may not matter. But today I hope to show you that this is kind of risky and that we should actually consider third language knowledge no matter what. All right, and so L3 research is really a relatively new domain, but of course there is research, so we know a little. And most of what we know is about the effect the L1 and the L2 may have on the L3. And just a very, very small set of research studies has investigated the opposite direction. So a possible influence the L3 may have on L1 and L2. And this is what I'm going to tell you more about today, actually in the second part of the talk. Because in the first part of the talk, I would like to draw your attention to another very important aspect, namely the effect of orthography in cross-linguistic interactions. And I think it is very easy to understand that orthography should be considered, considering that basically all of the participants we are testing are literate, right? So as soon as we're testing adults, unless it's a special population, we're testing literate people. And considering orthography is particularly important because we know that there are, in fact, strong effects of orthography on L2 production and also on L1 perception. And I'm going into a little bit more detail on this, particularly when I get to the first study I'm going to present, okay? But before this happens, I would like to give you some background on Spanish Basque bilinguals, because this is the population that we are typically testing at the BCBL, and also the participants of both studies that I'm going to present. All right, so you can see this blue heart-shaped area in northern Spain and also ranging into southern France, and that's the Basque Autonomous Community. The area I circled in red is Gipuzkoa, and that's where the BCBL is located. And this also happens to be the area with the largest proportion of Basque speakers. So we are really kind of in the bilingual center of the Basque country, which is excellent for our research, obviously. So Basque is a non-Indo-European language isolate, which means that it's completely different from any other language that is currently being spoken. And I would like to give you a brief example of how distinct Basque is. So just take a brief look at this language example. And the only thing I would like you to get from it is hopefully that you don't get anything, right? I mean, there's virtually no overlap between Basque and English in terms of vocabulary, grammar. You can also see that Basque is extremely inflected. And I am pretty sure that it also applies to any other language you know, right? So Basque should be substantially different. So here in San Sebastian or Donostia, that's actually the Basque name of the city, everything is completely bilingual. So as soon as I leave my apartment, I'm really immersed in a Spanish Basque bilingual environment. I hear both languages constantly, and I also read them constantly. So for example, all of the street signs, all of the advertisements you see are in both languages. Usually it's Basque first and Spanish second. And again, you can probably see that there's really no overlap between Spanish and Basque. And so nowadays, the most representative population we have, or the most common profile, is that people are L1 speakers of Spanish, and they have Basque either as a very early acquired second language or as a second first language, okay? So usually kids acquire Basque definitely before they turn like 2 to 3, because this is when they typically enter the public school system, which happens to be exclusively in Basque, okay? So basically they learn both languages from early on and through natural exposure. Nowadays, people are also learning English very early, but definitely, most definitely, I would say, after Basque. And it's typically, you know, a classical foreign language that is actually being taught as a foreign language. So it's completely different from Basque, which is really, learned through naturalistic input. All right, so just keep this in mind, because we're going to, I'm going to talk about studies involving this population, okay? Now I am going to start with the first study I would like to present, It's on orthographic effects in L1 and L2 speech production and perception, and it has recently been published in Bilingualism, Language and Cognition. So first, I would like to present you a little bit of more detailed background on what we know about orthography and speech production and perception. So most importantly, we know that orthographic representations are co-activated during speech processing. And this has first been shown for L1 speech perception. And this is a very seminal study in which the authors tested native speakers of English in an auditory rhyme detection task. So their task was to listen to word paths. They didn't see any orthographic forms at all. They just had to listen and to decide whether the words are rhyming or not. And as it turns out, people are a lot faster to make this rhyme judgment when they're listening to word paths like tie and pie, which happen to overlap in their spelling, as opposed to word paths like tie and rye, which obviously have the same rhyme, but they don't overlap in their spelling. So this was taken as evidence that during L1 speech processing, orthographic representations are automatically co-activated. We don't know very much about the role of orthography in L1 production, but in our lab, we have some preliminary evidence that orthography can actually affect phonetic aspects of L1 production as well. So to give you a concise example, in Spanish, we have the velar fricative ch, which can be spelled either with a G or a J. And as it turns out, the exact pronunciation, so the phonetic properties of these two sounds is slightly different depending on the spelling. So here we have the first preliminary evidence, at least, that orthography may in fact have an effect on L1 production as well. All right, so that's a little bit of background on L1. Now we turn to the L2, because there's actually a lot of evidence that orthography has a strong effect on L2 production. And I'm sure that all of you who speak a second language can relate to this. I think this is a very common phenomenon that all of us can experience. So the first study I would like to speak a little bit about is on L1 Italian learners of English. Italian is a language that has geminate consonants, which are long consonants. So Italian has a contrast between long and short consonants, and they happen to be spelled with a single versus a double letter. Of course, in English, we do have single and double letters as well, like in the words city and kitty, but phonetically, these two sounds are exactly the same, right? It doesn't matter if they are spelled with one or two letters. English native speakers don't have a length difference between the t in kitty and city. Well, as it turns out, those L1 Italian learners of English are actually carrying over their L1 Italian geminate contrast into English. So Italian learners of English would pronounce a word like kitty with a longer consonant than city. And quite important, this is also the case in speech production elicited without orthography, right? So again, it's evidence that orthographic forms are co-activated during L2 production. And then we should have a look at a second study, which is on L1 English learners of German. And here, so I find this study particularly compelling because it has been done on German learners immersed in a German environment. So I think these were high school students who did an exchange here in Germany. They lived in host families. They attended a German high school. So really, they were exposed to lots and lots and lots of native German input. But even here, in this context, we still observe orthographic effects in their speech production. So this study was particularly on the letter S, which corresponds to S in English. But in German, at least in syllable initial position, this sound is always voiced. So the German word for sun would be Sonne with a voiced fricative. And as it turns out, those L1 English learners of German carry over their English S. So they would say Sonne instead of Sonne. Another very interesting finding related to this study was that this effect was actually stronger in those participants who reported reading more. So it's a very dynamic kind of situation, and it provides evidence that so these orthographic effects are apparently that strong that even receiving lots and lots of native input does not cancel them out. So I find this, very fascinating. There has also been a little bit of research on the role of orthography on L2 perception, but this field of research is a little bit messy and the findings are quite unclear. So to move the field forward, we were asking the following question in this study. We wanted to know whether orthography would impact speech perception in early bilinguals who acquired both languages before becoming literate. So keep in mind our Spanish Basque population here, they learn both languages in childhood, usually before age 3, and then they start learning to read and write around 3 years later when they are around 6, okay? So before we get to the details, I would like to show you the contrast we were interested in. So in particular, we were looking at Spanish and Basque fricatives. Spanish has the interdental fricative th, theta, which is spelled with the letter Z, and also an S, which is produced with the tip of the tongue, and it's spelled with the letter S. Now, Basque has exactly the same sound and exactly the same spelling, but Basque also has a laminal S sound, which is produced more with the blade of the tongue, and it's spelled with the letter Z, just like the interdental fricative in Spanish. Okay, so for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to these two sounds as Spanish Z and Basque Z throughout, and to these two sounds as Spanish S and Basque S. So when we started this study, before, we only had some anecdotal evidence of what might be going on. So for production, we were told by local informants that it was quite common for L1 Spanish, L2 Basque bilingual adults to have a merger between Spanish S, Basque S, and the Basque Z. So based on this, it appears that the Spanish Z does not interfere. For perception, we didn't even have anecdotal evidence, so we had no clear idea of what might be happening. So to address our question, we tested 60 participants. Half of them were L2 Basque speakers with Spanish acquired from birth and Basque at around 3. And the other half were L1 Basque speakers with Basque acquired from birth and Spanish at around 3 years. And those groups were matched on age, gender, exposure to English, English proficiency, verbal and nonverbal IQ, and they essentially differed on exposure to Basque and Basque proficiency. The first experiment we conducted was an auditory lexical decision task, and this is the main experiment. And this task had Basque words containing the Basque Z that were either correctly pronounced or mispronounced with the Basque Z replaced by the Spanish Z. And this was our critical orthographic condition. Then, as a control condition, we also had the Basque Z replaced by a phoneme unrelated to orthography. So in this case, we picked ch, which is also voiceless fricative. In addition, so after this task, we actually checked participants' knowledge of the orthographic forms. So we had them do a little dictation task, and then on a by-participant basis, we removed trials from the LDT analyses in which participants didn't know the spelling. just to be sure that we get clean results. Okay, and here we predicted that L2 Basque speakers would have lower accuracy in the orthographic condition than in control. And for L1 Basque speakers, it was quite unclear. So on the one hand, the initial idea was to treat them kind of as a control group. But as we know, the L2 may very well affect the L1 as well. So in that case, it may also be that L2 orthography impacts on the L1, in which case we would expect the same pattern. Okay, so I'm now going to show you the results for the auditory lexical decision task. I'm going to plot the proportion of accurate responses on the y-axis, and you are going to see the results for L2 Basque speakers on the left, L1 Basque speakers on the right. In green, I'm going to plot the correct pronunciation, and in blue, the critical pronunciation, where Basque Z was replaced by Spanish Z. And finally, in purple, the control condition, where Basque Z was replaced by Ch. So for the L2 Basque speakers, we see that they perform really well on the correct pronunciation and on the control pronunciation, but they are kind of all over the place for the critical orthographic pronunciation. And interestingly, we get pretty much the same pattern in the L1 Basque speakers. So statistically, we observe critical effects of condition, meaning that participants perform significantly worse in the orthographic condition than in the other two. And we also got an effect of group, showing that overall, the L1 Basque speakers performed better than the L2 Basque speakers. But we didn't get an interaction between condition and group. So from this, it appears like both groups are less accurate when the mispronunciation is orthographic. So this can be, for now, taken as very neat results, but of course we have to be critical with ourselves. So we need to ask two what-ifs. And the first what-if is, what if participants simply cannot discriminate Basque Z and Spanish Z very well? Well, in this case, impaired perception might actually be unrelated to orthography, right? So we went on to test participants' discrimination ability of these two sounds. And we did that using an AXB discrimination task in which participants had to distinguish the Basque Z from Spanish Z in the critical condition and Basque Z from the control sound in the control condition. And the task was to determine whether the second item they heard was the same as the first or the third. And here we predicted and hoped, of course, that both groups would perform at ceiling in discrimination. And luckily, this is also what we observed. So you can see both groups of participants in both conditions performed really well. And in fact, we didn't observe any statistical differences here. So we can conclude that Basque Z and Spanish Z are easy enough to discriminate for both groups. So the results in the lexical decision task are unlikely due to a perceptual deficit. All right, but here comes the second what if. What if Basque Z is in fact commonly mispronounced as Spanish Z, despite the anecdotal evidence that we got? In this case, perception might be impaired by the input rather than directly by orthography, right? So this is why we decided to also test participants' speech production. And we did that in a word reading task in Spanish and Basque, which was blocked by language. So in the Basque part, participants had to read aloud Basque words containing the Basque Z and also the Basque S. And in the Spanish block, they were reading Spanish words containing the Spanish Z and Spanish S. And the measure we took was the center of gravity in Hertz. Okay, so here's just an example of a recording and the measurement we took. And here specifically, we predicted for L2 Basque speakers, in line with the anecdotal evidence we got, that they would produce Basque Z and Spanish Z distinctly, but Basque Z similar to Basque S and Spanish S. For L1 Basque speakers, we actually predicted distinct production of all sounds that are in fact distinct. Okay, so I'm now going to show you the results for speech production. So this time I'm going to plot the center and gravity in Hertz for L2 Basque speakers on the left and for L1 Basque speakers on the right. And I'm going to show you in yellow the production of S, and in turquoise the production of Z for both languages separately. Okay, so here's what we get for the L2 Basque speakers. So it seems like our prediction for the L2 speakers is in fact met, because we didn't observe any differences between Basque S, Basque Z, and Spanish S. These sounds were not statistically different in their production, but all of them were significantly different from the Spanish Z. Okay, and quite interestingly, for the L1 Basque speakers, we actually observe a very similar pattern. So there appears to be a merger going on in this L1 Basque population as well. But again, this merged category is different from the Spanish Z. So in sum, it appears that both groups produce Basque Z differently from Spanish Z, but Basque Z, Basque S, and Spanish S alike. All right. So let me briefly sum up and then provide a short discussion. In the lexical decision task, we showed that pre-literate bilinguals seem to be affected by grapheme to phoneme inconsistencies between the two languages in speech perception. The discrimination for both sounds was at ceiling, suggesting that the LDT results are unlikely due to a perceptual deficit. And in speech production, we observed, well, two important things, basically. So first of all, if you keep in mind the literature I presented earlier, saying that orthographic effects in L2 production are super strong and super common, we did not observe any of this in our early bilingual population. But this also means, since we don't get these orthographic effects in speech production in our population, we take this as an indication that the lexical decision results are actually unlikely due to inaccurate input. So we can draw a couple of conclusions from that. So first of all, we can conclude that orthographic representations may actually modulate already acquired sound categories in the L2 and even in the L1. So keep in mind, the participants learned both languages before the age of 3, and they only started learning to read and write at around 6. So basically, by the time they learned to read and write, they already had formed sound categories and representations, which were then apparently modified by learning the link between graphemes and phonemes. We can also conclude that perception categories are less stable than production categories. This is because we didn't observe any effects in production, but quite strong effects in perception. Also, we didn't observe any systematic differences between the L1 and the L2, meaning that in this specific case, the early acquired languages may actually behave quite similarly, of course, considering the specific environment in which we are testing. Okay, so let's take a look again at the general picture. So I hope to have convinced you by now that it is a good idea to take orthography into account in any studies on bilingualism and cross-linguistic influence. And now my next goal is to convince you that we should likewise take the role of a third language into consideration when even though we might be interested in the L2, right? But I'm going to show you, hopefully, that it's actually very important to consider the L3 as well. All right, so this brings us to the next study, very recently published in Language Learning and available open access as well, in case you're interested. Okay, so we already know very well that L1 and L2 constantly interact, right? We also know that the L1 and the L2 are going to influence the L3, and one direction might be stronger than the other. And there's some very limited evidence that the L3 may also impact L1 and L2. And there are basically two competing hypotheses regarding which of those links, so be it L1 and L3, or L2 and L3, is going to be stronger. On the one hand, we have the differential stability hypothesis, which is about acquisition order. So this hypothesis would specifically predict that there's a stronger interaction between the L2 and the L3, as opposed to between the L1 and the L3. And this is based on order of acquisition, okay? But then we also have the similarity convergence hypothesis, which says, well, it's actually about typological similarity between languages. So it doesn't really matter if it's the L1 or the L2. So if the L1 happens to be the language that is typologically closer to the L3, it's also going to be the language that interacts the most. Okay, so we're going to test these two hypotheses in our Spanish-Basque bilingual population. And this is actually an excellent test case for these two hypotheses because, as you will see, the predictions are exactly opposite. So under the similarity convergence hypothesis, we would predict that the L3, English, has a stronger impact on the L1, Spanish, because these two languages are typologically much closer than English and Basque are. So remember the example of Basque I gave you. I think if you keep that in mind, then it's very understandable that I consider English and Spanish as, well, much more related. So there is a considerable overlap in the lexicon of the two languages. The sentence structure is much more similar, and both of them are Indo-European languages, right? Okay, but then on the other hand, we have the differential stability hypothesis, which predicts that acquisition order matters most. In this case, we would predict that the L3 interferes more with the L2 than with the L1. However, this hypothesis has been tested on late acquired L2s. So it's not entirely clear if it would indeed apply to our early bilingual population as well. Also, the differential stability hypothesis so far has been tested on phonology and morphosyntax. And here, we're specifically going to test or to challenge the differential stability hypothesis by extending it to our early bilingual population and by testing two new domains of language, namely phonetics. And we do this through measures of VOT, voice onset time, and the lexicon through measures of lexical intrusions. So let me briefly tell you a little bit about voice onset time in Spanish, Basque, and English. Okay, so VOT is a feature of stop consonants like p, t, k, and it's defined as the time between the release of the consonant burst and the vowel onset or voicing onset more generally. So in English, we would get relatively long VOT. So here's an example of a production with 68 milliseconds, so clearly aspirated. But in Spanish and also in Basque, we don't have aspiration. So this VOT interval is substantially shorter. You may also anecdotally experience this as Spanish speakers when they pronounce words in English, starting with p-t-k, more sounding like b-d-g. And this is exactly because of this difference in VOT. Okay, So in this study, we tested 50 Spanish, Basque, English trilingual adults, and all of them were L1 speakers of Spanish, L2 speakers of Basque, and L3 speakers of English. And the L1, L2, L3 status was determined based on age of acquisition and also language proficiency, which was evaluated through measures of vocabulary, word recognition, and also through a structured interview. And lastly, we also took into consideration self-reported language exposure. So for each individual participant, the pattern was actually L1 Spanish, L2 Basque, L3 English. And we conducted our study online. This was mainly for practical reasons because we were still in the COVID aftermath at the time of testing and designing the study. And our participants completed 2 different sessions. In the first session, we had our main experiment, which was a speeded trilingual switching task. And in the second session, we had a speeded baseline naming task, which was needed to quantify the VOT changes in the switching task. And I'm going to explain this in a little bit when I get to the relevant study. Okay, so in this speeded trilingual switching task, participants essentially had to do picture naming in Spanish, Basque, and English, but all of the 3 languages were intermixed. So participants saw a picture with a flag, and the flag gave the language cue. And the trick here was that participants only had 900 milliseconds to respond. So this is really not a lot of time. This was a very difficult task. So participants, although the time window was so short, but we got a lot of swearing from our participants. So they were really challenged by this task. Okay, so in this example here, they would have to respond in Spanish, here in Basque, and here in English, okay? And overall, we used 12 unique pictures. All of them were non-cognates between all 3 languages, and they had to be named repeatedly in all 3 languages for a total of 816 trials. So I think the overall duration was a little bit over half an hour. Okay, so let's dive into the results, and I'm getting started with the lexical results. So the English intrusions in L1 Spanish and in L2 Basque. So keep in mind the 2 hypotheses we have. On the one hand, we have the similarity convergence hypothesis, which would predict that the most common error is to name a picture that is supposed to be named in Spanish in English. On the other hand, we have the differential stability hypothesis, which predicts that the most frequent error is naming a target Basque picture in English. So we have these 2 competing hypotheses and predictions. Okay, so I'm now going to show you the results for the percentage of L3 English intrusions in L1 Spanish on the left and in L2 Basque on the right. And we analyzed overall 180 Spanish and 180 Basque non-switch trials for each participant. And we could analyze data of 48 out of our 50 participants who produced English intrusions. So out of 50, there were only 2 people who didn't have any English intrusions at all. Okay, so here you can see each individual black dot corresponds to 1 participant, and the big red dot is the mean, okay? So I think we can see quite clearly that we get more L3 English intrusions in L2 Basque than in L1 Spanish. So when people are supposed to name a picture in Basque, they respond in English more frequently as opposed to when they are supposed to name a picture in Spanish. So this would be in line with the differential stability hypothesis. All right, so now we're going to take a look into the results for VOT production in the 2 languages. And here we decided not to do a comparison between Spanish and Basque directly. And this is because So we had a very limited number of individual words we could use. And as you probably know, VOT is never exactly the same between different words, right? And therefore, we also cannot assume that it's going to be exactly the same between Spanish and Basque, because obviously we have to use different words in the two languages. So therefore, it would be very likely to find a small difference between Spanish and Basque that is really just related to the word properties and cannot be explained by English. So therefore, we decided to conduct another task, which was our speeded baseline naming task, which was essentially the same task, so also a speeded picture naming task, but it was blocked by language. So there was no kind of artificial language interference that we created in this task. We used exactly the same pictures for the same number of trials, just blocked by language. So this allowed us to make a direct comparison between the VOT production in the switching task and in this baseline naming task. So in the similarity convergence hypothesis, we would predict that we observe an effect in L1 Spanish in the direction that VOT is going to be longer in the switching task than in the baseline task. And this is because English is highly coactivated in the switching task, and therefore we expect the longer English VOT to transfer more into Spanish during switching as compared to baseline. And for Basque, under the similarity convergence hypothesis, we didn't expect any differences. But considering the differential stability hypothesis, we would expect the exact opposite, right? So no effect in Spanish, but longer VOT in the switching task in Basque compared to the baseline task in Basque. Okay, so now what you're going to see are the results for VOT production plotted in milliseconds for L1 Spanish on the left and L2 Basque on the right. Baseline always left, switching right. And these analyses are based on 108 VOT non-switch trials per language and per task. Okay, so in Spanish, we get a very interesting pattern that wasn't predicted by any hypothesis. So we got shorter VOTs in the switching task than in the baseline task. In Basque, we got the opposite, with longer VOTs in switching, where English was coactivated, by the task, than in the baseline task, which was blocked by language. And this showed up as a language by task interaction that was highly significant. So we found that VOT in L1 Spanish was actually, as I said, shorter in switching than in baseline. And we think that this is due to speech rate, because what we found is that participants spoke faster in the switching task than in the baseline task. And it is quite well known that a faster speech rate is associated with shorter VOTs. All right, and then in English, in Basque, we observed the exact opposite with longer VOTs in the switching task than in baseline. But quite importantly here, we also observed this faster speech rate in the switching task. Basically, despite this shorter speech rate, faster speech rate, we still got longer VOTs. So we take this as evidence for influence from English, which again would be in line with the differential stability hypothesis. Okay, so again, let me sum up. So we observed more L3 English lexical intrusions in L2 Basque than in L1 Spanish. And we also observed a VOT increase in L2 Basque, but not in L1 Spanish. And I would like to highlight here that our participants overall had relatively low English proficiency. And quite importantly, they had very short English VOT to begin with. So if you remember the quite representative VOT example in English I gave you earlier, that was 68 milliseconds. And I think it's fair to assume that this is kind of a normal value for a native speaker of English. our participants on average only had 44 milliseconds. So of course, if they are coming from, a shorter VOT duration in English to begin with, we cannot expect the effects in Basque, or well, could also be Spanish, to be extremely strong, right? But we still observed it despite this relatively short baseline English VOT. So basically what we can conclude from this study is that we found support of and an extension for the differential stability hypothesis. We found stronger L3 to L2 influence despite the typological similarity between L1 and L3. We observed this for phonetics and for the lexicon, and also in early bilinguals in an immersion environment. So here, L2 and L1 were actually learned from naturalistic input, so not like in a classroom environment, but still we observed the effects predicted by the hypothesis. Okay, so we are almost done. Let me just formulate some general conclusions from this talk. So overall, what I hope to have shown you is that orthography may influence bilingual speech perception, potentially also production, even if the orthographic forms are not highly co-activated by the task, even in early bilinguals. And this really calls for an integration of orthography into models of bilingual speech perception and production, also considering, or especially considering, that the populations we're testing are usually highly literate. On the other hand, I hope to have convinced you that the L3 may influence the L2. And actually, so I don't have time to go into this today, but just so you know, we actually found evidence for the opposite direction as well, meaning that the L2 has a stronger influence on the L3 than the L1 does. And this is the case even if the L3 is relatively weak overall, even if the L2 was acquired in early childhood. So therefore, it's really important to consider participants' language background very carefully, even though you might be only interested in the L2 and your participants have learned a couple of years, may have had a couple of years of L2 instruction that you don't really care about. So to really understand your participants' linguistic behavior, I think it's extremely important to consider the L3 as well. So this is everything I wanted to share with you today. So thank you very much for your attention, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks. Should I stop sharing or leave the sharing?
Yeah, and then if anybody wants you to go back to a certain slide, we can just do that.
Okay, perfect.
Right, so I want to open the floor to questions, first from junior scientists, so PhD students and postdocs. You can unmute yourself or just type your question in the chat if you prefer that. Okay, questions from anyone else? Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. That was great. Obviously, you're using this term bilingual, aren't you? And whereas as somebody with both an L1 and L2, but obviously there, if you're learning a second language after you've learned to read, then it gets driven by the orthography in a way that's very different to if you were learning a second language because your mother spoke one language and your father spoke another language. And I think and I'm right, I'm not absolutely clear in the people you're studying whether these second languages have been taught through orthography or whether they've been taught simply because they're in a bilingual household, as it were.
Yeah, so for Spanish and Basque, it's really the case that both languages are acquired through natural input. So it's not necessarily the case in the household, but it's the case at school. So our participants here or well, everyone here nowadays, enters the public school system in the year they turn 2. Okay, and the public school system is entirely in Basque.
Entirely in Basque, yeah.
So what happens most of the time is that the family language is Spanish, because even if one of the parents is Basque, the other parent may be Spanish, and in that case, you know, Basque is a very, very difficult language to learn. So usually, if you're not from here and you haven't learned it in childhood, you're not going to learn it later on. So this means even if you have one Basque parent, one Spanish parent, most of the time the family language is going to be Spanish. But then as soon as the kid enters school, Basque is spoken by the teachers. Right. Still, most of the kids speak in Spanish among each other. So my 3-year-old daughter, she's going to a Basque German school, actually. So she's not supposed to know any Spanish, but she's perfectly fluent in it. So that's a very good real-life example of what's happening. But quite importantly, especially nowadays, English is also introduced in kindergarten. So also before kids know how to read. But it's still, you know, it's still taught as a foreign language. So it's not the case that the kids are just, you know, having the normal interaction all day long in English. This is specifically, a foreign language. But yeah, most of the participants we recruit here in the Basque Country, they will have learned English quite early. Now, don't ask me, well, English proficiency overall is so low, so something is apparently going, well, not ideal, at least. But yeah, acquisition usually happens.
I think that first experiment where you talked about pie and Thai, rye and Thai compared to pie, again, rye is a word you probably wouldn't have heard in the home, right? And so it's a word you would have learned through orthography, whereas pie you probably would have heard.
Of course. I mean,
and so the orthographic nature of words, it kind of depends on how you've learned them too, doesn't it? I mean, so there are plenty of words that I've read that I've probably never spoken or probably never heard spoken to me, you know. So obviously technical terms and politicians' names and whatever, you know. So you read these words all the time and you recognize them, but you don't really think of them in sound in the same way as you would a word.
No, that's exactly true. And I was personally not entirely happy with this example either. So I'm guessing and hoping that the authors did a very good job in matching their stimulus materials on all possible confounds. So I think they gave a couple of more examples in their paper. So it was, because for me, it was also quite striking that, rye is probably way less frequent than pie and pie are, right? Yeah. But I'm confident that these authors took that into consideration. And of course, I guess for a study like this, you need a lot of stimulus materials, right? So yeah, it may not be the best example. I fully agree on that. But, being a somewhat lazy researcher, I just took the example they provided.
Were you interrupting me, Rana?
No, I just wanted, I had a follow-up question, I guess, if you're done, Mark.
I was just going to, well, a little anecdote, which is just to end, was that I'm basically a monolingual speaker, but I know various words in various other languages. And certainly I feel that my L2 L-star lexicon is all jumbled up together. So all of the French and German words that I know, are all actually in one lexicon, all confused and mixed up together in some way. And so I quite easily would come up with a French word when I'm trying to speak German, for example, or something like this. Yeah. It's just a word that's not English, and therefore it sort of pops up in my head. So certainly the idea that L2 and L3 and LN languages are intermixed in some way seems perfectly logical to me. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. So I'm still thinking about your results of the first experiment. And my question is kind of linked to what Mark also asked about. So if you say that these participants are immersed in the education system where they everything is taught in Basque only. So I'm guessing that means that the instruction books and whatever they read at school is all in Basque, right? So do they read in Spanish though? And how much do you have knowledge about their exposure to written language in both of these languages? Like, you know, I'm trilingual, but I have a preference for the languages that I like to read in. And I'm guessing if you have that knowledge and if you think it might have impacted your results in some way.
Yeah, so how it works here, in the public school system, everything is taught in Basque with Basque textbooks, except for Spanish literature and foreign language classes, okay? But still in like, you know, when participants or when students are being taught English, instruction is supposed to happen in English, but sometimes you have to give explanations in another language, right? And this language is supposed to be Basque. Okay, but still, from early on, they start learning to read and write in both languages in parallel, so in Spanish and Basque, okay? Also, I must say that right now we have a lot of like children's books and books in general in Basque available as well, but this is a fairly new development. So since our participants were already in their 20s when we tested them, my assumption would be that by the time they were kids, books were actually mostly available in Spanish. So my guess is that they're actually, I'm not sure if I should say more proficient readers in Spanish, because that's just, you know, my personal impression, but I don't have evidence for that. What we observed, though, is for all language proficiency measures we routinely take from our participants, there's virtually no variation in their Spanish skills whatsoever. So they're all at ceiling in Spanish, and where we get variability is in Basque.
But you didn't test specific proficiency in like reading in each of these languages.
No,
It was
no, we
more
didn't.
general language proficiency.
No, we didn't do that. We just, as I mentioned, after our lexical decision task, we had them do a dictation task, so spelling task basically in Basque, and we got a fair number of misspellings there. So even though, you know, you kind of imagine, well, these people have been in the Basque school system for 16 years, so they should be completely fluent and proficient. That's still not the case. So again, my assumption would be that they are pretty much at ceiling in Spanish, but again, I have no evidence to support that idea.
Cool. Any other questions before we finish?
There was one thing from that first study which I didn't understand. You were measuring the center of gravity of spectra and finding that the Basque S and the Basque Z were the same.
Right.
But then you started off by saying that one is apical and one is laminar. I think that's what you said.
Supposedly.
But you're saying, but are they different in some other way other than the center of gravity, like different durations or something?
Let me explain. So in Basque, the Basque country is an extremely small area, right? So we only have like, I think 2 million Basque speakers, including L2 speakers, right? So it's a very small community with an incredible regional variation. So in many areas, we know that this merger is happening. We didn't know it was happening in our region because this is where supposedly the standard Basque is spoken, which is supposed to have this contrast between apical and laminal. From older participants, we also know that this is still happening. But we were kind of surprised when we tested our young population, even though they were L1 speakers of Basque, they didn't have this contrast anymore. So we basically discovered a new merger that is happening here in the region.
A sociophonetic phenomenon.
Exactly. And I mean, Basque is really an endangered language. There's not that much research on Basque, let alone phonetic research on Basque. I think I just talked to a Basque phonetician, and he said he recently did a search, and there are like 40 papers on Basque, which are at least somewhat related to phonetics. So there's really not a lot we know about the different dialects. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Antia. That was really great. We're very glad to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for listening to me. I really appreciate it.
We are more than happy to have had you here. And thanks everyone for joining us. Like I said, this is our last talk for the term. You'll hear from me about our next term speaker in due course. And thanks everyone. Have a nice Christmas break. And thanks again for our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great break.
You too. Bye.
Bye.